Andrew Callahan locked the doors of his upscale restaurant, Callahan's, as the rain pelted against the glass. The sound of the storm mirrored the emptiness he felt in his own life, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Outside, the dim light from the street lamp illuminated the wet pavement, casting long shadows in the alley beside the restaurant. Andrew pulled his coat tighter as he turned to leave, but a movement near the entrance caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just a pile of rags, discarded like so many other remnants of life that littered the streets. But then the rags shifted. A small figure, huddled against the cold, shivered in the faint glow. He hesitated, his first instinct being to walk away. It wasn't his business, he told himself. Yet something rooted him to the spot. "Hey," Andrew called out cautiously, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" The figure stirred but didn't respond. A faint, raspy voice broke through the sound of the rain. "I'm just sleeping. Please don't call anyone." As Andrew crouched down, the girl's face came into view. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her hair matted and her clothes soaked through. Her arms clutched a threadbare blanket, as if it were her only shield from the world. Andrew's chest tightened. He wasn't used to feeling much of anything these days, but this scene stirred something deep within him. "You can't stay out here," he said firmly, though his tone softened when she flinched at his voice. "You'll get sick." "I don't have anywhere else to go," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Andrew looked up and down the deserted street. No one else was around to intervene, no one else who might take responsibility. With a sigh, he extended a hand. "Come inside. It's warm." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the street as if weighing whether to run. But eventually, she took his hand. Her small, icy fingers sent a jolt through him as he led her into the warmth of the restaurant. Once inside, Andrew retrieved a clean towel from the kitchen and handed it to her. She clutched it tightly, staring at him with wide, wary eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the floor, as if deciding whether to trust him. "Rosie," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rosie," Andrew repeated, kneeling to her level. "I'm Andrew. You're safe here." Rosie said nothing, but her grip on the towel relaxed ever so slightly. Andrew prepared a bowl of soup from the kitchen, setting it in front of her. She ate slowly, cautiously, as though unsure if it might be taken away. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, though the question felt like an intrusion. Rosie stiffened, her spoon hovering midair. "I don't have any," she said flatly, her tone betraying more pain than she likely intended. She looked away, and Andrew decided not to press further. As she ate, Andrew noticed something glinting around her neck. A small, tarnished medal hung from a frayed string. His heart skipped a beat. It looked eerily familiar, though he couldn't place why. "That's a nice medal," he said, trying to sound casual. "Where'd you get it?" Rosie instinctively covered it with her hand, her expression guarded. "It was my mom's," she said softly. "She said it belonged to someone who was supposed to take care of us." Andrew's chest tightened. Something about her words stirred a memory he thought he had buried long ago. He forced a smile, not wanting to alarm her. "It's very special," he said simply. By the time Rosie finished her soup, her eyelids were drooping. Andrew knew she needed rest. "There's a couch in my office," he offered. "You can sleep there tonight. We'll figure things out in the morning." Rosie hesitated again, but eventually followed him to the small office at the back of the restaurant. She curled up on the couch, the towel still wrapped around her shoulders. Within minutes, she was fast asleep. Andrew stood in the doorway, watching her. She looked so fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her face that reminded him of someone he hadn't thought about in years. His gaze drifted back to the medal, now visible again as Rosie slept. The initials engraved on its surface caught the light. AC. Andrew's breath hitched. It was impossible. The medal was identical to the one he had given his daughter more than 25 years ago, the last Christmas they had spent together before everything fell apart. He turned away, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the empty dining room, staring out at the rain and wondering what on earth he had stumbled into. Andrew spent the early hours of the morning sitting at the dining table, his thoughts racing. The soft patter of rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence that only amplified the questions swirling in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Rosie clutching that metal, its tarnished surface reflecting the faint light. The initials, AC, were unmistakable. He had held that metal in his own hands all those years ago, watched as his daughter, Emily, wore it proudly around her neck. How could it have ended up with this girl? Rosie stirred just as the first light of dawn filtered through the restaurant's windows. Andrew stood quietly in the doorway of his office, watching her rub her eyes and stretch. She looked disoriented for a moment, then seemed to remember where she was. Her eyes found him, and she tensed. "You're safe," he said softly, raising his hands as if to reassure her. "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast." Rosie nodded cautiously, sliding off the couch and wrapping the towel tighter around her shoulders. Andrew guided her to a booth in the corner, setting out a plate of toast and scrambled eggs. She ate quickly, like someone who wasn't sure when their next meal would come. He couldn't stop himself from asking, though he tried to sound gentle. "Rosie, do you remember anything else about your mom? Did she ever talk about where she got that medal?" Rosie paused, her fork hovering over the plate. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing whether to trust him. "She said it belonged to someone important," she finally said. "Someone who cared about us but couldn't be there." Andrew's throat tightened. His mind drifted to Emily, to the last time he saw her. She had been 9 years old, standing in the doorway of her mother's car with tears in her eyes. The divorce had been ugly, and his ex-wife had insisted on leaving Chicago with Emily. Andrew had fought for custody but lost, and in the aftermath, he had buried himself in his work, too consumed by his own bitterness to fight harder. "Do you know his name?" he asked carefully, his voice strained. Rosie shook her head. "Mom didn't like to talk about it. She just said he was a good man, even if he made mistakes." Andrew felt a pang of guilt, his chest tightening further. He wanted to push for more details, but Rosie's guarded expression told him she was reaching her limit. Instead, he shifted gears. "Rosie, would you like to stay here for a little while? Until we figure out what to do next?" Her eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of hope in them. "You mean it? I don't have to go back?" Andrew frowned. "Back where?" Rosie hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "To my stepdad," she said in a small voice. "He's mean. He wasn't nice to my mom either." Andrew's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. Whoever this man was, Andrew was determined to ensure Rosie never had to see him again. "You don't have to go back," he said firmly. "Not ever." Rosie nodded, relief washing over her face. But there was still a shadow of fear in her eyes, a wariness that only deepened Andrew's resolve. He knew he couldn't protect her alone, at least not in the long term. He needed help. Later that morning, Andrew made a discreet phone call to his friend Marcia, a social worker who had helped him set up charitable programs for underprivileged children through his restaurant. He explained Rosie's situation without revealing too much. "She's scared, Marcia. I don't think she has anyone else," he said. "And there's something about her. Something I need to figure out." Marcia sighed on the other end of the line. "Andrew, you know this is complicated. If her stepfather has legal custody, you could be accused of kidnapping." "I'm not letting her go back to him," Andrew snapped, more forcefully than he intended. "She's not safe there." Okay, Marcia said. "Let me make a few calls." "But Andrew, if there's something personal going on here, you need to tread carefully." He hung up, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. Marcia was right, of course, but the thought of losing Rosie, of sending her back to a life of fear and pain, was unbearable. Over the next few days, Rosie began to open up, little by little. She told Andrew about her mother, a kind woman who had worked hard to keep them afloat but had fallen ill. Rosie's memories were fragmented, as if she were trying to block out the worst parts. She spoke less about her stepfather, only mentioning that he wasn't family, not really. In turn, Andrew shared bits of his own life, careful not to overwhelm her. He told her about the restaurant, how he had built it from the ground up, and how cooking had always been his way of finding peace. Rosie listened intently, her curiosity slowly replacing her initial distrust. One evening, as they cleaned up the kitchen together, Rosie finally asked the question Andrew had been dreading. "Why are you helping me?" Andrew froze, his hands stilling on the dish he was drying. He met her gaze, unsure of how much to say. "Because you deserve it," he said after a moment. "Because no one should have to go through what you've been through." Rosie studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, she surprised him by smiling, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Thanks," she said softly. That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep, Andrew sat alone in the dining room, the medal in his hand. He turned it over, tracing the worn initials with his thumb. AC. Andrew Callahan. It had to be more than a coincidence. The questions gnawed at him. Was Rosie connected to Emily? And if so, what had happened to his daughter? As much as he wanted answers, he knew he couldn't push Rosie any further. At least, not yet. But one thing was certain. He wasn't letting her go. Not until he uncovered the truth. Over the next week, Andrew adjusted to having Rosie around, though the situation was far from normal. The restaurant became a strange sort of refuge for the girl. During the day, she helped Andrew with small tasks, like organizing menus or folding napkins, her tiny hands moving with a focus that surprised him. At night, she curled up on the office couch, her breathing steady and calm, as if this small pocket of safety was more than she had known in years. Andrew couldn't help but notice how quickly Rosie adapted. She was careful, deliberate in how she interacted with him and the space around her, as though afraid that one wrong move might make it all disappear. Yet every now and then, she let her guard down. A genuine smile here, a curious question there. It was in those moments that Andrew felt a growing protectiveness, a pull he couldn't fully explain. She wasn't just some kid in need. She was beginning to feel like family. But the unanswered questions hung heavy in the air. Andrew spent his nights piecing together fragments of Rosie's story. He didn't want to scare her by pushing too hard, but the threads of the past were becoming impossible to ignore. That metal had tied them together in a way that felt far too coincidental to dismiss. If Rosie's mother was Emily's daughter, then the pieces were starting to form a picture Andrew wasn't sure he was ready to face. One morning, while Rosie was setting out silverware, Andrew sat across from her at the table. "Rosie," he began gently, "I need to ask you something important." She paused, a fork in her hand, and looked up at him warily. "Your stepdad," he continued, careful to keep his tone even. "Do you remember his name? Or where he might be now?" Rosie's grip on the fork tightened. For a moment, Andrew thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a small voice, she said, "His name is Carl. Carl Decker." Andrew nodded, filing the name away. "Do you think he might come looking for you?" Her face darkened, and she set the fork down. "I don't know," she said quietly. "He didn't care about me. He just wanted to keep control." The way she said it, so matter-of-factly, made Andrew's chest ache. He reached across the table, resting a hand lightly over hers. "You don't have to worry about him," he said. "I'll make sure he doesn't hurt you again." Rosie didn't respond, but she didn't pull her hand away either. That small gesture felt like a step forward, a fragile truce between her instinct to protect herself and the trust she was starting to place in him. Later that day, Andrew made another call to Marcia. "I have a name," he told her. "Carl Decker. He's the stepfather. Can you find out anything about him?" Marcia sighed on the other end of the line. "Andrew, you know this isn't exactly in my job description, but I'll see what I can do. Just be careful. If this man has any legal claim over Rosie, things could get messy." Andrew thanked her, his jaw tightening. He didn't care about the legalities. What mattered was keeping Rosie safe. That evening, as Andrew closed the restaurant for the night, he noticed Rosie staring out the window, her small frame silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights. She was holding the medal in her hands, turning it over and over as if it might reveal some hidden truth. "Rosie," he said softly, coming to stand beside her, "can I see that for a second?" She hesitated, then handed it to him. Andrew held the medal carefully, the weight of it so familiar in his hand that it sent a pang of memory rushing through him. He traced the initials again, AC, and his mind traveled back to the day he'd given it to Emily. She loved this thing, he said, more to himself than to Rosie. She wore it everywhere. Rosie's brow furrowed. Who? Andrew froze, realizing he had said too much. But as he looked into Rosie's curious, searching eyes, he decided he couldn't keep hiding his suspicions. She deserved the truth, at least part of it. My daughter, he said finally. Her name was Emily. I gave her a medal just like this when she was about your age. Rosie tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. What happened to her? Andrew swallowed hard. We lost touch, he admitted. It's complicated, but seeing this medal and meeting you, it makes me wonder if maybe you're connected to her somehow. Rosie stared at him for a long moment, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else. Hope. Maybe. Then she said, Mom used to talk about her dad. She said he was kind, but that he made mistakes. She said he gave her something special before they had to leave. Andrew felt a lump rise in his throat. Rosie, he said carefully, did your mom ever tell you her name? Her name was Emma, Rosie said, but sometimes people called her Emily. Andrew's breath caught. He gripped the back of the chair beside him, the weight of her words hitting him like a wave. Could it really be true? Could Rosie be Emily's daughter, his granddaughter? Before he could say anything more, there was a knock at the door. The sound shattered the fragile moment, and Rosie flinched, her eyes darting toward the noise. Andrew's heart pounded as he approached the door. When he opened it, he was met with the last person he expected, Marcia, her face grim. We need to talk, she said, stepping inside. I looked into Carl Decker. And you're not going to like what I found. Rosie shrank back into the shadows as Marcia entered, her presence casting an air of tension over the room. Andrew clenched his fists, bracing himself for whatever revelation was about to come. Marcia looked at him, then at Rosie, and sighed heavily. He's already looking for her, Andrew, and he's not going to stop. Andrew's gaze shifted to Rosie, who was now clutching the medal tightly again, her small frame trembling. In that moment, Andrew knew one thing for certain. No matter what it took, he wasn't going to let Carl Decker, or anyone else, take her away. Andrew felt the weight of Marcia's words settle over him like a heavy fog. Carl Decker was looking for Rosie, and the thought of that man finding her sent a surge of protective determination through him. He glanced at Rosie, who was still clutching the medal like it was the only thing tethering her to safety. Her wide eyes darted nervously between him and Marcia. Do you know where he is now? Andrew asked, his voice low and steady. Marcia hesitated. I don't have an exact location, but I know he's filed a report. He's claiming Rosie ran away, and if he pushes hard enough, the authorities might come looking. Rosie's face went pale, and she shrank further into the corner of the booth. Andrew immediately moved to her side, kneeling so their eyes were level. Listen to me, he said gently, his voice firm but reassuring. No one is going to take you back to him. I promise. Rosie blinked back tears, her small hands tightening around the medal. What if they make me go? She whispered, her voice trembling. What if he finds me? Andrew glanced at Marcia, who gave him a pointed look. They both knew how complicated the situation could become if Carl had any legal claim to Rosie. But Andrew wasn't about to let that man take her. I'll handle it, he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. You're safe with me. Marcia sighed, her expression softening. Andrew, I know you mean well, but promises like that are dangerous. If Carl has any documentation, any custody rights, this could get ugly fast. Then I'll fight him, Andrew snapped. Whatever it takes. Marcia nodded slowly. I can look into his background, see if there's anything that might help your case. But in the meantime, you need to be careful. Keep her out of sight as much as possible. Andrew agreed, though the words felt hollow. The restaurant, once his sanctuary, now felt like a fragile bubble that could burst at any moment. As Marcia left, Andrew turned his attention back to Rosie, who hadn't moved from the corner. Do you trust me? He asked softly. She nodded after a moment, her grip on the medal loosening slightly. I think so. Good, he said, offering her a small smile. Because I'm not going to let anything happen to you. The days that followed were a careful balancing act. Andrew kept Rosie in the back of the restaurant during business hours, away from prying eyes. She stayed in his office, reading or sketching on scraps of paper he gave her. In the evenings, when the restaurant was closed, they ventured out briefly for walks or errands, always staying alert for anything, or anyone, out of place. Despite the tension, Andrew found himself cherishing their growing bond. Rosie had a sharp mind and a quiet resilience that reminded him so much of Emily at her age. She asked questions about the restaurant, about the people who came to dine, and even about Andrew's past, though she was careful not to press too hard. For someone so young, she had an uncanny ability to sense when someone needed space. One night, as they shared a simple dinner in the empty dining room, Rosie surprised him with a question that cut straight to his heart. "Do you think my mom would have liked this place?" she asked, her voice tentative. Andrew paused, his fork hovering midair. "I think she would have loved it," he said, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "Emily always appreciated good food, even when she was a kid. She used to sit in the kitchen with me and try to guess the ingredients in whatever I was making." Rosie's eyes lit up. "She did." Andrew nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "She was smart, just like you." Rosie looked down at her plate, a small smile playing on her lips. For a moment, the tension of the past few days seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of connection. But the peace didn't last. Late that night, after Rosie had gone to sleep, Andrew received a call from Marcia. "I found something," she said, her tone serious. "Carl doesn't have legal custody of Rosie. He never formally adopted her, and her mother never listed him as a guardian." "That's the good news." "And the bad news?" Andrew asked, his stomach sinking. "The bad news is, he's been telling anyone who will listen that Rosie's his responsibility. If he gets the right people involved, it could still cause trouble. And there's more. He has a history, domestic abuse charges, restraining orders. It's not a pretty picture." Andrew gripped the edge of his desk, anger simmering beneath the surface. "That's exactly why she can't go back to him." "I understand," Marcia said, "but you need to be strategic. If this goes to court, you'll need solid evidence to prove she's better off with you. And you might need to be ready for questions about your connection to her." Andrew's breath hitched. He had been avoiding the inevitable conclusion, but he knew Marcia was right. If he wanted to protect Rosie, he would need to confront the truth about her identity and his own role in her life. After the call ended, Andrew sat in silence, staring at the medal on his desk. It felt heavier than ever, a symbol of the past he couldn't outrun. But now, it was also a link to the future, a future he was determined to secure for Rosie. The next morning, as Rosie helped him set up for the day, Andrew made a decision. He knelt beside her, meeting her gaze with a seriousness she immediately picked up on. "Rosie," he said, his voice steady, "I need to tell you something. About your mom. And about me." She tilted her head, her eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. "What is it?" Andrew took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I think your mom, Emily, was my daughter." Rosie froze, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Does that mean you're my grandpa?" Andrew nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I think so, Rosie. I think I am." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, her small fingers gripping tightly. "Does that mean you're going to keep me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Andrew's chest ached with the weight of her words. He wrapped his other hand over hers, his voice firm with conviction. "Yes, Rosie, I'm going to keep you. No one is ever taking you away." And for the first time in years, Andrew felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that, despite everything, he might have a second chance to be the family he had once lost. Rosie stared at Andrew for a long moment, her expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. The words hung between them, fragile but powerful. "I'm your grandpa." Andrew could see the gears turning in her mind, trying to make sense of this revelation, to reconcile the man standing in front of her with the family she had always been told was out of reach. "Why didn't she tell me about you?" Rosie asked finally, her voice small but steady. Andrew exhaled, the weight of the past pressing down on him. I don't know, he admitted honestly. Things were complicated between me and your mom when she was little. I made mistakes. Big ones. And by the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late to fix it. I think maybe she thought I didn't care. Rosie frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of the metal still clutched in her hand. But you did care? Andrew nodded, his throat tightening. More than anything. I just didn't know how to show it back then. I let work and other things get in the way. But I never stopped thinking about her. About what could have been. Rosie's gaze softened, but Andrew could see the hesitation lingering in her eyes. She had spent years learning to rely on no one but herself. Trust wasn't something that came easily. He didn't blame her. He knew he would have to earn it. What happens now? She asked quietly. Andrew leaned forward, his hands resting on the table between them. What happens now is I keep my promise to you. We're going to figure this out together. Rosie, you're not alone anymore. Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but she stopped herself. Even if Carl comes after us? Especially if Carl comes after us, Andrew said firmly. He's not going to hurt you. I'll make sure of it. For the first time since they'd met, Rosie reached out and placed her small hand over his. It was a fleeting gesture, but it was enough to light a spark of hope in Andrew's chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. That afternoon, while Rosie occupied herself in the office with a coloring book Andrew had picked up at a nearby store, Marcia arrived at the restaurant. Her face was lined with concern as she pulled Andrew aside. I've got more on Carl, she said in a low voice. He's filed an official petition for custody. He's claiming Rosie is a runaway and that he's her rightful guardian. Andrew clenched his jaw, anger flaring in his chest. He's not her guardian. He never even adopted her. No, but the court doesn't know that yet, Marcia said. The problem is, if he keeps making noise, they'll start asking questions. You could be accused of harboring her illegally. Andrew rubbed a hand over his face, frustration mounting. What are my options? Marcia hesitated. You'll need proof that she's better off with you. That's going to mean digging into Carl's past and showing the court who he really is. It also means you'll need to prove your connection to her. Andrew nodded, his mind racing. What about her mother? If we can prove Rosie's mom was my daughter, that could change everything. Marcia sighed. It could, but we'd need documentation, birth certificates, records. And even then, it won't be easy. Andrew's chest tightened. He thought about Emily, about how much he had already failed her. He couldn't fail Rosie too. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Just tell me where to start. The next few days were a whirlwind of research and preparation. Marcia worked tirelessly to gather information on Carl, uncovering a disturbing pattern of abusive behavior and a criminal record that painted a clear picture of the man's unfitness as a guardian. Meanwhile, Andrew focused on proving his connection to Rosie, searching through old boxes of paperwork and photos for anything that might help. Rosie, sensing the tension in the air, remained quiet but observant. She asked few questions, though Andrew could tell she was piecing things together in her own way. One evening, as they sat together in the office, she broke her silence. Do you think she'd be proud of me? Rosie asked suddenly, her voice tentative. Andrew looked up from the stack of papers he had been sorting through. Your mom? Rosie nodded. She always wanted me to be brave, to stand up for myself. But sometimes I don't feel very brave. Andrew set the papers aside and moved to sit beside her. Rosie, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You are one of the bravest people I've ever met. What you've been through, what you've survived, it takes more courage than most people could imagine. And I know your mom would be so proud of you. Tears welled in Rosie's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, a small smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. You really think so? I know so, Andrew said. And I'm proud of you too. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Andrew's heart sank, dread pooling in his stomach. He exchanged a glance with Rosie before standing to answer it. When he opened the door, a man in a cheap suit stood on the other side, holding a clipboard. Andrew Callahan? The man asked, his tone clipped. Yes, Andrew replied cautiously. The man handed him a piece of paper. You've been served. Custody hearing in 2 weeks. Be there. Andrew stared at the document in his hand as the man walked away, his mind racing. A custody hearing. This was it. Carl was coming for Rosie, and Andrew had 2 weeks to prove she belonged with him. He turned back to find Rosie watching him, her face pale. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Andrew forced a reassuring smile, though his hands trembled slightly. "It's nothing we can't handle," he said. "I promised I'd protect you, and I'm going to keep that promise." As he spoke, he felt a new resolve settle over him. He wasn't just fighting for Rosie now. He was fighting for Emily's memory, for the chance to finally make things right. And no matter what it took, he wasn't going to let Carl, or anyone else, tear their newfound family apart. The days leading up to the custody hearing passed in a blur of preparation and quiet determination. Andrew threw himself into the process with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. Every spare moment was spent building his case, gathering documents, reaching out to old contacts, and working closely with Marcia. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about legalities. It was about Rosie's future, her safety, and the fragile bond they were only just beginning to build. Rosie, meanwhile, watched everything unfold with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Andrew could see the weight of it in her eyes, the way she clutched that small medal as if it were her lifeline. He made a point to include her in the process, explaining what they were doing and why, even when the details felt overwhelming. She had been through too much to be left in the dark, and Andrew wanted her to know she wasn't alone in this fight. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Rosie broke the silence. "What happens if we lose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew looked up from the legal forms he'd been reviewing, his heart aching at the fear in her tone. "We're not going to lose," he said firmly. "But what if we do?" Rosie pressed, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "Will he take me back?" Andrew leaned forward, resting his hands on the table between them. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "No one is taking you back to him. Not as long as I have anything to say about it. We're going to win this, Rosie. You have to believe that." Her eyes searched his face, looking for reassurance, and after a long moment, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "I believe you." But the truth was, Andrew wasn't sure what would happen if they lost. The thought of Carl getting anywhere near Rosie again was enough to keep him awake at night. He pushed those fears aside, focusing instead on what needed to be done. A few days before the hearing, Marcia called with an update. "I've found someone who might be able to help," she said. "It's a long shot, but it could make a difference." "Who?" Andrew asked, his curiosity piqued. "A former neighbor of Carl's," Marcia explained. "She's willing to testify about what she witnessed when Rosie and her mom were living there. It's not pretty, but it paints a clear picture of who Carl really is." Andrew felt a flicker of hope. "That's exactly what we need," he said. "Thank you, Marcia." The woman, Mrs. Gallagher, was a retired teacher with a no-nonsense demeanor and a sharp memory. When Andrew met her to go over her statement, she didn't mince words. "I saw that man for what he was the day he moved in," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "I tried to help Rosie's mother, but she wouldn't listen. She was too scared." Andrew's heart ached as he listened to Mrs. Gallagher recount stories of shouting matches, broken windows, and nights when Rosie would appear on her doorstep, bruised and trembling. It was painful to hear, but it solidified Andrew's resolve. He would make sure the court knew exactly who Carl was and why Rosie could never go back to him. The day of the hearing arrived, and Andrew felt a mix of nerves and determination as he and Rosie entered the courthouse. He had done everything he could to prepare, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead was impossible to ignore. Rosie clung to his hand, her small fingers cold against his. She didn't say much, but the way she stayed close to him spoke volumes about how much she was counting on him. Inside the courtroom, Carl was already seated at the plaintiff's table, his face set in a smug expression that made Andrew's blood boil. He looked every bit the manipulative, calculating man Marcia had described. But Andrew forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about anger. It was about the truth. The hearing began, and both sides presented their cases. Andrew's attorney, a kind but sharp woman named Elaine, laid out the evidence against Carl with precision, She introduced police records, witness statements, and even the letter Emily had written years ago, naming Andrew as someone she trusted to care for Rosie. Mrs. Gallagher's testimony was particularly damning, painting a vivid picture of the abuse Rosie and her mother had endured. Carl, for his part, tried to play the role of a concerned guardian. He spoke about how he had done his best for Rosie and accused Andrew of interfering in their family matters. But his arguments rang hollow, especially when Elaine pressed him on his history of domestic violence. Throughout the proceedings, Rosie sat quietly beside Andrew, her eyes darting between the attorneys and the judge. When it was her turn to speak, Andrew felt his chest tighten. He had tried to prepare her for this moment, but he knew how daunting it was for a child to stand before a room full of strangers and talk about things no child should have to endure. Rosie stood and took a deep breath, her small frame seeming to grow stronger with each word. She spoke about her mom, about the nights they spent hiding from Carl's outbursts, and about how safe she felt with Andrew. Her voice trembled at times, but she didn't falter. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the judge finally announced her decision, Andrew held his breath. The court finds that it is in the best interest of the child, Rosie Decker, to remain in the custody of Andrew Callahan, the judge declared. This ruling is based on the evidence presented regarding the unfitness of Mr. Carl Decker as a guardian and the demonstrated ability of Mr. Callahan to provide a stable and loving environment. The words hit Andrew like a wave, and he felt Rosie's hand tighten around his. She turned to him, her eyes wide with relief, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. A real, unguarded smile that lit up her entire face. "It's over," she whispered. Andrew pulled her into a tight hug, his own eyes stinging with tears. "It's over," he echoed. And for the first time in years, he felt like his world was finally beginning to heal. The relief of the court's decision was overwhelming, but Andrew knew it was just the beginning of their journey. As he and Rosie walked out of the courthouse, a quiet kind of peace settled over them. Rosie stayed close to his side, her hand still gripping his tightly, as if afraid to let go. The world outside the courtroom felt bigger and brighter, but Andrew could sense the lingering uncertainty in her steps. "Are we really safe now?" Rosie asked softly as they reached the car. Andrew knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Yes, Rosie," he said with conviction. "He can't take you away. You're with me now, and that's not going to change." Her lips quivered as she nodded, the weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift. She climbed into the car, clutching the metal tightly against her chest, and for the first time since Andrew had met her, she leaned back in her seat with a deep, contented sigh. Life began to take on a sense of normalcy in the weeks that followed. Rosie moved out of the small office at the restaurant and into Andrew's home, a spacious yet quiet house that had always felt too big for just him. Her presence brought life to the empty rooms, her laughter echoing in hallways that had been silent for years. Andrew found himself rearranging his routines to make space for her, adjusting his work schedule so he could be home in the evenings and learning the small but important details of her world. How she liked her toast cut into triangles, the way she hummed when she was focused, the books she loved to read. Rosie, too, began to settle into her new life. She started attending a nearby school, where her quick wit and natural curiosity began to shine. Andrew couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time she came home with stories about her day, her excitement infectious as she recounted a lesson or a new friend she'd made. But even as she flourished, he noticed the small, cautious habits she couldn't quite shake. Checking the locks on the doors, flinching at loud noises, the way her eyes darted to him for reassurance whenever she felt unsure. Andrew made a point of being patient. He understood that trust, real trust, would take time. He had missed years of her life, years he couldn't get back, but he was determined to make every moment they had now count. He started small, planning quiet evenings at home where they could cook dinner together or watch old movies. Slowly, those moments began to pile up, building a foundation of safety and love that Rosie could lean on. One evening, as they sat on the living room floor piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, Rosie spoke up unexpectedly. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" Andrew looked up from the puzzle, his heart catching at the question. "Your mom?" Rosie nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly turning a puzzle piece over in her hand. I think about her a lot. About what she'd say if she could see us now. Andrew reached out, covering her hand with his. I think she'd be more than proud, he said softly. I think she'd be happy knowing you're safe and cared for. And I think she'd be proud of how brave you've been. Rosie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. I miss her, she whispered. But being here with you, it helps. Andrew felt his throat tighten. I miss her too, he said. But you're right. Being together helps. As the days turned into weeks, Andrew began to feel something he hadn't in years. Hope. Rosie's presence had reignited a part of him he thought he had lost forever. She reminded him of the best parts of Emily, the curiosity, the resilience, the quiet strength. But she was also her own person, a vibrant and unique soul who brought joy into his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Their bond deepened as they navigated the rhythms of their new life. Andrew took Rosie to the farmer's market on weekends, teaching her how to pick the ripest tomatoes and the freshest herbs. She, in turn, surprised him with her sharp eye and growing confidence. One afternoon, she declared she wanted to make her own recipe, and together they created a dish she called Rosie's Pasta, a simple yet delicious meal that quickly became their favorite. But not everything was easy. Rosie still had nightmares sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night with tears streaming down her face. Andrew always came to her side, sitting with her until the fear subsided, assuring her that she was safe. Those moments were hard, but they also brought them closer, each one a reminder of the trust they were building together. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, Rosie sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the metal in her hands. Why did she keep this? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Why didn't she just let it go? Andrew sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Because it meant something to her, he said. It was a connection to the past, to the good memories she held on to. Just like it means something to you now. Rosie leaned her head against his arm, her breathing slowly evening out. It's like it's all I have left of her, she murmured. Andrew kissed the top of her head. You have more than that, Rosie. You have the memories, the lessons she taught you, and the love she gave you. And you have me. We're carrying her with us every day. For the first time in a long time, Rosie let herself relax. She fell asleep leaning against Andrew, her grip on the metal loosening slightly. As he tucked her back into bed, Andrew felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, not just to be a grandfather, but to be the kind of family Rosie deserved. And in that quiet moment, as the house settled into stillness, Andrew realized that their journey, though far from over, was finally on solid ground. Together, they were building something new, something beautiful, and he knew that Emily would have been proud. As the months passed, life for Andrew and Rosie began to feel less like a fragile experiment and more like a real family. Their routines were no longer dictated by fear, but by the rhythms of daily life. School drop-offs, shared meals, evenings spent talking or playing games. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer loomed so large. Rosie was thriving, and Andrew felt a pride that he couldn't fully put into words. One sunny afternoon, Rosie came home from school with a bright smile and a piece of paper clutched in her hand. We're having a family day at school, she announced, waving the flyer. It's next weekend. They said we can bring someone to share a story about our family. Andrew glanced at the paper, his heart swelling at the sight of her excitement. That sounds great, he said, smiling. Who do you want to bring? Rosie gave him a look, as if the answer was obvious. You, Grandpa. Who else? The word still caught him by surprise sometimes, but it warmed him in a way few things ever had. I'd be honored, he said, pulling her into a hug. In the days leading up to the event, Rosie's anticipation was infectious. She spent hours brainstorming what story Andrew could share, bouncing between ideas about cooking mishaps and funny moments from their time together. But as the date approached, Andrew couldn't shake a nagging thought. The story Rosie wanted wasn't just about him. It was about her, about them, and about the family they were rebuilding piece by piece. When the day finally arrived, the school buzzed with activity. Parents and grandparents filled the classrooms, sharing stories and meeting teachers. Andrew felt a pang of nervousness as he walked through the halls with Rosie, her small hand gripping his. This was a new world for him, one he hadn't stepped into since Emily was a child. But Rosie's confidence bolstered him. Inside the classroom, Rosie introduced him to her teacher, Mrs. Walker, and a few classmates. She seemed at ease, smiling and chatting as if she had always belonged. Andrew watched her with a mixture of awe and pride. The shy, guarded girl he had first met was transforming into someone who carried herself with quiet strength. When it was their turn to share, Rosie stood at the front of the room beside Andrew, her eyes shining with excitement. "This is my grandpa," she said proudly. "He's going to tell you about something special." Andrew glanced at her, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He had planned to share a lighthearted story about the time Rosie had tried to cook a complicated recipe on her own. But now, looking at her, he knew he needed to say something more. "Hi, everyone," Andrew began, his voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm Rosie's grandpa, and I'd like to tell you about what makes our family special. It's not just the things we do together or the time we spend, though those are important. What makes us special is that we found each other when we both needed family the most." The room grew quiet, the children listening intently. Rosie's eyes were fixed on him, wide and unblinking. "Sometimes families aren't about who you've known the longest or who shares your last name," Andrew continued. "Sometimes they're about the people who show up when it matters most, the ones who remind you that love and kindness can heal even the deepest hurts." He glanced down at Rosie, who was gripping her medal, a symbol of their journey. "Rosie is the bravest person I know," he said, his voice catching slightly. "She's taught me more about strength and love in the past few months than I've learned in my entire life. And being her grandpa has been the greatest honor I could have ever imagined." Rosie's face broke into a smile, her cheeks pink with pride. The room erupted in applause, and Andrew felt a wave of relief and gratitude. As they returned to their seats, Rosie whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. That was perfect." The rest of the event passed in a blur of conversations and activities, but Andrew couldn't stop replaying that moment in his mind. For the first time, he truly felt like he belonged, not just in Rosie's life, but in the world they were creating together. That evening, as they sat on the couch at home, Rosie curled up beside him with a contented sigh. "Today was the best day," she said. "It felt like everything is finally okay." Andrew wrapped an arm around her, his heart full. "That's because it is, Rosie. We've been through a lot, but we're a team now, and nothing's going to change that." She tilted her head up to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think Mom would have liked the story you told?" Andrew nodded without hesitation. "I think she would have loved it, and I think she'd be proud of both of us." Rosie smiled, a soft, sleepy smile that made Andrew's chest ache with affection. "I think so too," she murmured, resting her head against his shoulder. As she drifted off to sleep, Andrew stared out the window, watching the sun set over the quiet street. For years, he had convinced himself that the life he wanted, the family he had lost, was beyond his reach. But now, with Rosie beside him, he felt something he hadn't in decades: peace. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. Together, he and Rosie were rewriting their story, one filled with love, resilience, and the promise of brighter days ahead. And for Andrew, that was more than enough. The days turned into weeks, and life continued to take on a comforting rhythm. Andrew found himself embracing the unexpected joys of being a grandfather, attending Rosie's school events, helping her with homework, and simply enjoying the moments that once seemed out of reach. Rosie, in turn, grew more confident and happy, her laughter filling the spaces that had long been silent in Andrew's home. But even as they moved forward, reminders of the past had a way of creeping in. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, Andrew stumbled upon an old box he hadn't touched in years. It was labeled Emily, written in his neat handwriting, and the sight of it stopped him in his tracks. He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled the box down and sat on the floor. Inside were remnants of a life long gone. Photographs of Emily as a child, drawings she'd made, and the medal that matched Rosie's, still gleaming as if it had been waiting for this moment. Andrew held it carefully, the memories flooding back with a force that left him breathless. He hadn't realized how much he missed her until that very moment, when the weight of his mistakes and the love he'd always carried for her collided. "Grandpa?" Rosie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her expression curious as she eyed the box in front of him. Andrew smiled, though his eyes were misty. "Come here, Rosie. I want to show you something." She crossed the room and sat beside him, her gaze falling on the contents of the box. Andrew handed her one of the photographs, a picture of Emily at Rosie's age, grinning widely as she held up a goldfish in a small plastic bag. Rosie's eyes widened. "She looks like me," Rosie said softly. "She does," Andrew agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "You have her smile." Rosie picked up the medal next, her fingers tracing the familiar initials. "This is like mine." "It is," Andrew said. "I gave one to your mom and kept this one for myself. I thought one day I'd give it back to her." Rosie was quiet for a moment, turning the medal over in her hands. "I wish she were here," she whispered. "I wish she could see us now." Andrew wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I do too, sweetheart," he said. "But you know what? I think she'd be so proud of you, of us. And I think she's watching over us, cheering us on." Rosie leaned into him, her small frame warm against his side. "Do you think she was happy before everything happened?" Andrew hesitated, searching for the right words. "I think she had hard times, Rosie, but I also think she loved you more than anything. You made her happy, and she would want you to know that." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the box together, Andrew sharing stories of Emily's childhood and the moments that had brought them joy. It wasn't easy, but it felt right, as if they were piecing together not just the past but also the foundation of their own bond. The following week, Andrew received a call from Marcia. "I've got some news you'll want to hear," she said, her tone serious but hopeful. Andrew's stomach clenched. "What is it?" "Carl has left town," Marcia explained. "Apparently, he was evicted and decided to move out of state. It's unlikely he'll pursue anything further." Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The relief was palpable, but so was the lingering tension. "Do you think he's really gone for good?" "It's hard to say," Marcia admitted. "But for now, it looks like you and Rosie have some breathing room." Andrew thanked her, hanging up and turning the news over in his mind. The idea that Carl might no longer be a threat was a huge weight lifted, but Andrew knew better than to assume they were completely free of him. Still, he chose to focus on the positives. This was a chance to truly move forward. That evening, he shared the news with Rosie over dinner. Her reaction was quiet but telling. She seemed to sit a little straighter, her shoulders relaxing in a way he hadn't seen before. "So he's gone?" she asked cautiously. "For now, yes," Andrew said. "But even if he comes back, we're ready. You're safe, Rosie." "I'll make sure of it." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I believe you." With the shadow of Carl fading, Andrew and Rosie leaned fully into their new life. They began making plans for the future, weekend trips, home projects, and even the possibility of turning part of the restaurant into a space for community events. Rosie's idea of hosting a cooking class for kids became a favorite topic of conversation, her excitement infectious as she brainstormed themes and recipes. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Rosie turned to Andrew with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked. "Happy?" Andrew considered her question carefully. "I think happiness isn't something we always have, Rosie," he said. "It's something we work at, every day. There will be hard times, but as long as we stick together, I believe we can keep finding happiness. Because we've already proven we can get through the tough stuff." Rosie seemed to mull that over, then nodded. "I like that," she said. "It makes me feel hopeful." Andrew smiled, pulling her into a hug. "That's exactly what it should do." As they sat together, the quiet night stretching around them, Andrew felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The road that had brought them here had been anything but easy, but it had also been worth every step. Rosie had given him a second chance, not just at being a family, but at truly living. And for Andrew, there was no greater gift. The crisp fall air carried a sense of renewal as Andrew and Rosie prepared for a special evening at the restaurant. It wasn't just any night. Andrew had decided to host a community dinner, a way to give back to the neighborhood that had supported him through the years and to celebrate the new chapter of his life with Rosie. The idea had started small, but like so many of their plans, it had grown into something bigger, fueled by Rosie's enthusiasm and Andrew's desire to create something meaningful. Rosie had been involved in every step of the planning, from choosing the menu to decorating the tables. She insisted on including her signature dish, Rosie's pasta, which Andrew had proudly added to the restaurant's menu as a tribute to her creativity. She flitted around the dining room that evening, carefully adjusting centerpieces and chatting with the staff as if she'd been running restaurants her whole life. Andrew watched her with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had come so far in such a short time, and her confidence was contagious. As guests began to arrive, the restaurant filled with the hum of conversation and laughter. Neighbors, friends, and even a few of Rosie's classmates and their families filed in, their warmth and excitement creating an atmosphere of celebration. Andrew greeted everyone personally, his handshake firm and his smile genuine, but his attention kept drifting back to Rosie. She moved through the crowd with ease, her bright smile lighting up every interaction. Midway through the evening, Andrew tapped a spoon against a glass to gather everyone's attention. The room quieted as he stepped to the center, Rosie standing beside him. She looked up at him expectantly, her small hand slipping into his. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Andrew began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "This evening is special for so many reasons, but the most important one is standing right here beside me. Rosie has brought something into my life that I didn't know I was missing. Hope, love, and a reminder of what it means to be a family." The room erupted in applause, and Rosie blushed, ducking her head with a shy smile. Andrew waited for the clapping to subside before continuing. "This restaurant has always been a place where people come together, not just for food, but for connection. And tonight, we celebrate that connection. We celebrate resilience, second chances, and the family we build along the way." Rosie tugged on his hand, leaning up to whisper in his ear. "Tell them about the medal," she urged. Andrew chuckled softly, nodding. "Rosie wants me to share a story about this medal she wears," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "It's a medal I gave to my daughter, Emily, many years ago. I lost touch with Emily, but this medal found its way back to me through Rosie. It's a symbol of everything we've lost, but also everything we've found." He looked down at Rosie, who was beaming up at him, her courage shining through. "Rosie reminds me every day that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a chance to make things right. And for that, I'm forever grateful." The applause was thunderous this time, the room filled with cheers and laughter. Rosie hugged Andrew tightly, and he felt her trembling with excitement. "You're the best grandpa ever," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. As the evening continued, Andrew found himself surrounded by friends and neighbors offering words of encouragement and admiration. But what mattered most to him was Rosie's joy. She danced between tables, chatted with the staff, and even helped serve plates of her pasta, earning praise from everyone who tried it. Near the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, Andrew stepped out onto the restaurant's back patio for a moment of quiet. The cool night air was refreshing, and he gazed up at the stars, feeling a profound sense of peace. He had spent so many years chasing success, trying to fill the void left by his mistakes, and now, here he was, not with trophies or accolades, but with something far greater, a family. "Grandpa," Rosie's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her sweater pulled tight against the chill. "Hey, kiddo," he said, beckoning her over. She joined him at the railing, her eyes following his gaze to the stars. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Andrew smiled, his heart swelling at the question. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," he said. "And it's all because of you." Rosie leaned against his side, her head resting on his arm. "I'm happy too," she said after a moment. "I didn't think I could be, not after everything that happened. But now, I feel like I have a real home, You do? Andrew assured her. And you always will. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the restaurant fading into the background. Finally, Rosie reached into her pocket and pulled out the medal, holding it up so it glinted in the moonlight. I think Mom would have liked tonight, she said thoughtfully. She'd be proud of us. Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. I think so too, he said. She'd be proud of you most of all. Rosie turned to him with a radiant smile, one that seemed to chase away every shadow of doubt or fear. Thanks for not giving up on me, she said. Andrew knelt down so they were eye to eye, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. I'll never give up on you, Rosie. Not ever. As they embraced under the stars, Andrew felt a sense of completeness he hadn't known in years. He had spent so much of his life searching for meaning, for purpose, and now he realized it had been waiting for him all along, in the love of a granddaughter who had given him a second chance. Together, they had built something unshakable, something beautiful. And for Andrew, that was more than enough. It was everything.